was asked to speak about a variety of topics dealing with investing in the United States, and the topic is a little broader, I think, on the agenda. I wanted to read it here. It says, U.S. investment legislation, general rules, treatment as individuals, corporations, and offshore companies. When Octavio and Aloisio asked me to speak on that many topics in 20 minutes, they must have forgotten that I'm an attorney. One thing about attorneys is we can fill up 20 minutes pretty easily. There's one thing that, the old joke, you can't shut an attorney up. But anyhow, if you have the ability to listen to the headphone set, you'll enjoy her voice more than mine. But anyway, let's get started. We're speaking on basic fundamentals with respect to a couple different corporate formalities or corporate forms that one can take when bringing their business or incorporating a new business into the United States. I'm partial to Florida. It's not just because my law firm, my main headquarters of the law firm is in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. My practice actually evolves around the country, and the law firm itself is globally. Florida is one of the most asset protection friendly states, which is one of the goals when you're looking to preserve assets. And it also has some of the best tax benefits as well. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the presentation. But as you will see, there's various types of corporate forms. The most common types of corporate forms are what's referred to as an LLC, which is an abbreviation for limited liability company, an S Corp, and a C Corp, two different types of corporate forms. I'm not going to spend any time today on S Corp status because generally, as I understand it, most of you will not qualify for that. One of the main qualifications is you have to be a citizen or a permanent resident of the states. So we'll focus the attention of this presentation to LLCs, some of the formalities, some of the benefits of both LLCs and C Corps. The basics of a C Corp. Well, I want to start off talking about ownership, and then I'll speak a little bit about the liability consequences within a C Corp, and then also some of the tax considerations, which throughout this presentation I'll be focusing on liability protections to hopefully protect ideas to protect your assets, and again some of your tax considerations. The main theme, though, the main thing that I want everybody to leave here with is, while there are ways to minimize tax burden on corporations in the United States, and there are ways to minimize exposure of your assets, there is not a way to completely eliminate taxes, although that would be a wonderful thing if anybody could achieve it. And the other thing is, with respect to corporate formalities, one of the great things about investing and forming corporations here in the States, and particularly in Florida, is the government here uses what some would refer to as an honor system. There's really no government individual looking over your shoulder with every step that your business takes. But that can be a benefit, and it also can be a detriment. Because if you don't follow the formalities, then eventually it will catch up with you. I always tell my clients it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. You may get away with it for 20 years, 10 years, 15 years. You may only get away with it for 6 months. But I hear the story every time of, but everybody else is doing it this way. Well, eventually it will catch up with you. And the consequences and the penalties are severe. Your assets all of a sudden become exposed. Your tax consequences and penalties go through the roof. So it makes most sense to figure out what corporation suits your needs on the front end, spend a little bit of money on the front end, and avoid having to spend a whole lot on the back end. So back to corporate forms. The ownership, one of the characteristics of ownership in a corporation is its ownership is determined by shareholders. Now, shareholders, that's a concept a lot of us have heard. It's designated by the number of shares or stocks, the amount of stock that you actually own in a particular corporation. There's no minimum number, which is a benefit. There's no minimum number of shares that a corporation must issue. They can issue as many shares as they want. it also accommodates, which is a benefit, it accommodates multiple types of stock. So some of you may have heard the difference between common stock and preferred stock. Common stock is something that is common to most people. That's something that anybody that wants to invest into the corporation will buy a share of what's called common stock. It doesn't really give them any preferential treatment. Whenever distributions are paid, they're paid pro rata across the board on the common stock. Preferred stock is exactly what the word said. It gives you some form of preferential treatment. And a corporation, to raise capital, can do something like that. So if you have a corporation, you want to raise capital, you can issue what's called preferred stock, give these funders a little more preferential treatment in terms of dividend return and so on and so forth. Distributions, I touched on this a moment ago, is regardless of when distributions are paid, the most important part is when distributions are made. If there's 2 shareholders or 100 shareholders, within each class, they all must receive proportionate share. So assuming, just to use round numbers, there's 1,000 shares of stock that are issued, and there's 10 shareholders each owning 100 shares, each of them gets a 10% pro rata distribution of whatever the distribution might be. The liability, which is something good with the C Corp form, is your liability is generally limited by the investment you make into the company. So if you invest $10,000 into the company and something happens to the company fails, well, they're not going to come after your personal assets, so long as the corporate formalities were followed. Your investment will generally be limited by, your exposure to that liability will generally be limited by the amount of the investment that you made. So again, you're protected from your corporate creditors. Tax considerations, one of the pitfalls and the disadvantages, if you will, of a C Corp form is that before any distributions are made, the revenue coming into the corporation is taxed at the corporate level, and then once you actually receive it, you'll be taxed again at the individual level. So you have what we like to refer to as double taxation. It's not really something that anybody wants to do. Nobody wants to give Uncle Sam or whoever the DO is in South America an extra money to the government. That's something we try to avoid. So there's ways around it, but it's more difficult than a C Corp. The limited liability company is a little different. What I like to say is a limited liability company brings a corporation the benefits of asset protection, liability exposure of a corporation, together with some of the less formal partnership obligations, brings the best of both worlds together and gives, in what in most scenarios is really the ideal corporate form. It doesn't mean that it fits everybody, but it is, in a lot of scenarios, the ideal form. The basics of an LLC, one of the reasons why it's most prevalent here in Florida, we have a lot of foreign investors in Florida, and it's the most common form of corporation, if you will, for foreign investors because of the laxed standards, if you will. So again, I'll talk about ownership, liability, and some of the advantages that the LLC carries. First, unlike the corporate C Corp form, there's no shareholders. So there's no shares that are issued. Instead, if there's one owner or 2 owners or 3 owners, however many owners there are, 100 owners of the LLC, the owners are labeled as members. So you're a member in this particular LLC, you're a member in this particular company. The good thing is the members can include individuals, can include other domestic corporations, or it can include foreign individuals or entities. So if you have a corporation in Brazil and you wanted to have that corporation as a member of the LLC here in the States, that could be one of your members, and anybody else could be another member. The profits, one of the good things about the LLC, the profits do not need to be distributed equally. So even though ownership is equal, you could have unequal distribution, and we'll have an example of that in a moment. But that's a benefit because you're able to adjust according to what type of work goes into the LLC. The liability, this is one of the benefits that's been carried over from the corporate form. Your liability, if, it's a big caveat, if all your formalities are followed, if you do what you're supposed to do in terms of reportings, and keeping the corporate form up to par and up to all standards, then you're again going to be able to enjoy limited liability, which is the amount of your investment into the company. Your personal assets should not generally be subject to any creditor or any corporate debt. The advantages, again, this is something the LLC left behind in the corporate form but took over from the partnership, is you're not subject to the double taxation. So as the funds flow through the corporation and it comes to you individually, so long as there aren't other federal income taxes that come into play, and we'll talk about that also in a minute, there's no double taxation. You have a single taxation on the personal level. There's a flexible corporate structure, thank you. There's a flexible corporate structure, and you don't have to have a board of directors. You don't have to have stockholder agreements. You have instead what's called an operating agreement. Operating agreement is very important when you have, especially when you have more than one member in your corporation. Why is it? It's the contract, if you will, between you and your other members. And a lot of people don't like going through this formality, but it can be devastating to the corporation, to the LLC, in years later if you don't go through this formality. Give you a real brief example. A great friend, great client that is from Argentina comes over to the States, opens up his corporation, tells me he has this a good friend of his, and he's sharing it 50-50 and not doing an operating agreement. I sent him emails, I sent him letters, I sent the postal service over to him telling him, don't do this, don't do this. And he did. Business was fantastic. Went through 10 years, no problem. Making millions of dollars. What ended up happening? Partnership got into dispute. Nobody knew how to resolve anything. Ultimately, you go into statutory default, which is not really something that benefits you or your company, and dissolution occurs, and now the company's down to nothing. So you must enter into this operating agreement because it allows you to really, at the onset, determine each other's rights, obligations, responsibilities, roles, and it sets the flexible corporate structure. Again, one of the advantages, unlike some form of corporations, this form is totally open to foreign investments and entities. So, as I said a minute ago, unequal distribution is one of the benefits that I see in a corporate, in an LLC versus a corporation, whereas in the corporate form, like a C Corp, you have to share distributions equally pro rata throughout each class of share. In an LLC, you don't have to amongst the ownership of the corporation. And here's a little example. Say we have a company called Real Estate Ventures LLC, and that company has 3 partners. The 3 partners each inject equity into the company of $10,000 apiece. So each has a third ownership in the company. You have 2 of the owners, Lucas, and here's Lucas, everybody meet Lucas, and Juliana, that actually work on the business. And they're actively working and engaging and trying to bring fruits to hang down from the tree of this business and make the business grow. But as everybody who's been in business before, you always have who I like to refer to as Nervous Nicholas. Nervous Nicholas is somebody who only provided the initial capital, but second guesses everything you do. And he does it, he's not there to help grow the company. Instead, he just continues to second guess and doesn't do much, and he just sits back and hopes his investment turns into something greater than his $10,000. Well, in a C Corp, again, because they're all individual equal ownership, they would have to be treated the same if they're all in the same class of shares, where they would all have to be paid the same on distributions. In an LLC, however, if Lucas, Juliana, and Nicholas all agreed that Lucas and Juliana were going to be doing the bulk of the work, they could also agree in the operating agreement that even though they're equal owners, Juliana and Lucas share more in the fruits of the labor. So they would be able to get more of the profit distribution as the company makes a return. So that's one of the benefits, easy benefits of an LLC. LLC liability. This is an example of how your personal assets, if the corporate formalities are followed, are protected. Let's take the same company, Real Estate Ventures, they enter into a contract with Harper Properties. Now, Real Estate Ventures, your company, breaches that contract. You break the contract, you don't perform your obligations, and now Harper's turns around and sues you for $1 million. And what happens then? Well, if your formalities were followed, the three investors, the three owners, Lucas, Juliana, and Nicholas, need not worry. Because even though there's $1 million lawsuit against the company, their exposure is going to be limited to the $10,000 investment infusion that they gave at the front end. Real Estate Ventures assets are going to be protected. Thank you. Briefly, a couple other important aspects of an LLC. Some states require for you to have the full benefit of the protection that I spoke about, you to have more than one member. This is a tricky component because a lot of folks, especially in the real estate market, they'll buy a piece of property, incorporate an LLC, and have a single member. And they think, well, I have a corporate status, so I'm able to protect all my personal assets and my personal creditors from seizing any corporate assets. Well, not so. In Florida, there was a recent case law that ultimately made its way, thereafter made its way through Congress and then was codified into a statute that says if you're a single member LLC and you get a personal judgment against you, i.e. you're the only owner in the LLC, you get a personal judgment against you, if your creditor can show the court that they are not reasonably likely to collect against you personally, they can actually take your corporate interest. Okay? It's easy to navigate around that by adding another member and doing it properly. Some might think, well, that's a pitfall of Florida, let's move to Delaware, or let's move to another state. The problem with moving to another state that hasn't decided this issue, it's uncertain. The benefit of Florida is now we know how to navigate around it. Delaware, for instance, has the exact same statute that was recently interpreted by the courts in Florida on this particular issue, but they're silent. The courts have not ruled on it in Delaware. So if I were advising a client, I'd say be very careful, follow the more stringent standard as it is in Florida, because Delaware or some other jurisdiction can come out against you and subject all your personal liability to the corporation. Another aspect, if it's a company that's being actively engaged in business, there is a portion of it that's going to be subject to self-employment tax federally. That's across the board under any jurisdiction, any state, for members who are actively involved in the management of the company. Again, for real estate purposes, if you're receiving rental income, that by the government is considered passive income, and therefore it's not subject to taxes. So the last couple slides, I know I'm moving fast, but it's a lot of area to cover in such a short period of time, is the question I get all the time. Everybody hears about Delaware being this place to invest and this place to have corporations, and it used to be. Let's say over the past 10 to 20 years, Florida and a lot of other jurisdictions have really caught up to Delaware. Florida is about equal with it now, from my perspective anyways, from the corporate formality standpoint, in terms of how to do things, the benefits of the corporate structure itself. Where I think Florida actually goes a step further is the various forms of asset protection. A lot of times you hear Florida referred to as the debtor's haven. You have friends like O.J. Simpson, who after getting $1 million of judgment on him, comes down here. Everybody who's escaping liability comes down to Florida. It's because of the very strong asset protections in this state. And those asset protections actually, in a lot of respects, relates over to the corporate form. So I think Florida is probably better, if you're investing in Florida, if you're in Florida, Florida's where you likely want to be. Briefly though, I've looked at some of the differences, because there are differences. There are differences when you go state by state, and I wanted to highlight some of the ones where I thought you all might be most interested. So, state corporate income tax. Both have state corporate income tax. Florida has, their rate is 5.5 of any income that's taxable over $5,000. So if the company is engaging in business and receiving revenue that is actually taxable, they won't start taxing any dollar until you're over $5,000. Delaware likes to tax you from $1. they'll tax you at a rate of 8.7% currently from your first dollar. Personal income tax. Florida has none, and Delaware does have one. It ranges anywhere from 2.5% or 2.2% to approximately 7%. Franchise tax. Florida, again, has none. Delaware does have franchise tax. If you're engaging in franchise opportunities, or you may be going there, Delaware, you're going to get stuck paying franchise fees. And it varies based on the size of the franchise. Well, Delaware beats us here on one thing. We have a sales tax of 6%, but Delaware does not have a state sales tax. And lastly, where I really believe, and any lawyer will tell you, where Delaware really takes the cake, if you will, and really earns its name, is the fact that they have what's called and referred to as a dedicated business court. The benefit of Delaware throughout the years has been that Delaware figured it out judicially from the beginning. They have a court that's dedicated solely to business disputes. So the body of law and what we refer to as the jurisprudence that comes out of Delaware is been worked on for decades upon decades upon decades. Where if you go to any other jurisdiction, even Florida, up until recently, you had the same courts that are deciding whether to send somebody, away for, committing murder, deciding also your corporate fate. So it wasn't the best situation to be having a criminal judge also deciding things about business. What I will say with respect to at least Florida, I can't opine on the other states, is that Florida has, over the past 5 to 7 years, actually developed their own dedicated complex business court. So whenever there's complex business situations, there's a dedicated court for that. And when there's a gap in Florida law, almost always, you'll have the Florida courts that defer and look to Delaware for the answer. And so, in my mind, it evens Florida out with Delaware. And again, if you're investing in Florida, if you're doing business in Florida, it probably makes most sense. It all depends on your circumstances, but it probably makes more sense to invest in Florida. So, the answer of what entity and where, I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to say it. It depends. It depends on your circumstances. Clients hate to hear that, but it really, really does when you're trying to minimize your taxes and protect your most valuable assets. It depends on what they are, where they are, how many employees you have, if you have any employees in the first instance, where the property is located. But most importantly, and I touched on this throughout, it's not as easy as filling out a form online and getting a corporate name and getting a receipt from the Department of the Secretary of State saying you have a corporation, congratulations. It is critical that all the formalities are followed from day one all the way through. Trust me, you will save tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars as your business grows if you actually do things right on the front end. If there's, I'll have a little bit of time to answer questions, but again, cases are very specific when it comes to corporate formalities. My information's in the back, but also here you'll see my direct office dial rings right to my desk in Fort Lauderdale and my email address. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions.